And then our next speaker is the co-founder and CEO of Sanku Project Healthy Children and has spent a decade developing solutions to address the big gap in fortification. A warm welcome to Felix Brooks Church.
Thank you. Good morning. It's an honor to share the stage with Paula. I actually contracted schistosomiasis in 2012 while swimming in Lake Malawi. It entered my leg, it spread to my lungs, urinating blood. I lost a lot of weight and was undiagnosed for many months. But luckily I had access to good health care. I was treated and obviously survived. But so many people, especially children and babies, don't survive from it. So her work is incredibly important. So from schistosomiasis to malnutrition, there's a relationship there. Sanku, we're a nonprofit social enterprise based in Africa, East Africa, and we're tackling a 2 billion person problem, which is malnutrition. This is where we're at today. We have about 250 locations throughout East Africa, feeding close to 2 million people with fortified flour. Fortified flour means we're adding nutrients, vitamins, and minerals to flour to make it stronger, to make it fortified. And it turns into literally life-saving nutrients, especially for small children and babies. So what I want to do is talk about a story how we came from 0 people reached, essentially up to 2 million people reached. So it started with a problem and understanding the problem. In East Africa, everybody eats the same thing. It's called maize. It's a maize porridge or corn porridge that they consume every day, large amounts of it. Mothers cook it every day, children eat it, and then they get sick. They don't get sick necessarily from the food. They get sick because they're not eating enough complementary foods around that, not enough vitamins and minerals in their diets. So they suffer from things like stunting, neural tube defects, cognitive development issues, physical and mental stunting, which will affect them for the rest of their lives. If you have these micronutrient deficiencies within the first 1,000 days of your life, a lot of times the damage is irreversible. So it's so important for our work to get to, especially children, within those first 1,000 days. So we know nutrition works. We have decades, if not centuries, of evidence that if you consume vitamins and minerals, you'll be stronger, you'll have a stronger immune system, you'll grow, you'll be smarter, you'll have a higher IQ. This is evident, this is fact, and so with that knowledge in the West or the developing countries or high-income countries, however you want to define that, there's been laws for decades mandating that large, centrally processed food companies add these nutrients to the staple foods that we consume every day, whether that's iron to Kellogg's cornflakes, or iodine to salt, or vitamin A to oil. This is law in most of the developing countries because it works. Unfortunately, in East Africa especially, there isn't this centralized food network. There isn't industrial food supply to get to all the remote locations. So even though some countries have passed laws mandating fortification, mandating that these companies add nutrients to the food, it's not actually getting to the people who need it most, the most remote locations. So we are addressing a big gap in fortification in East Africa. In Tanzania, for example, centrally processed foods reach about 5% of the population, meaning 95%, over 50 million people in Tanzania rely on their food source from a village or a town-level mill, a small mill that actually grinds up the grain, produces the flour that they eat every day. So no matter how successful large-scale fortification initiatives have been in Tanzania, there's still 95% that are neglected, arguably the most in need of these interventions. And that's where Sanku comes in. We address the 95% and we close the gap in fortification. So what does a small-scale mill look like? Every village might have one, every town might have a dozen, every city even might have a few hundred. These are the mills about the size of the stage that feed over 50 million people. And so for us, it was an aha moment about 8 years ago when we were researching how do we reach the most amount of people for the least amount of money. Well, instead of going door by door and handing out supplements or handing out vitamins literally to people to consume every day, we thought, why don't we add the vitamins at this source because this machine is feeding on average about 5,000 people. A no-brainer, right? And so that's what we did. So we thought, okay, great. If we can build a mechanism that precisely adds these key life-saving nutrients to the flour at these machines, we're going to reach a lot of people, and we're going to do it very, very cheap. And it's very measurable as well. So that's just what we did. Just to walk you through the process, the visual, the small mills are milling primarily raw maize in East Africa. So the miller pours this raw maize into the machine. The machine then grinds it up. It's actually called a hammer mill. It pulverizes that grain into flour, which is then blown out into a bucket and collected by a customer, usually a mother, and packed into a bag, at which point it's sent home and consumed by the family, especially children. So this was our moment to think, okay, again, if we can add something to this machine, dose these vitamins, these key vitamins into the flour, we're going to reach a lot of people. So we thought that's pretty obvious, and how come nobody else kind of figured this out? Well, people did try, and they failed for 3 reasons. Number one, there was no technology. There's no technology to do this automated process, this precise process every day, every hour, every time. There was no, even if the machine worked, there was no way for people to know that it was going to be used ongoing, that it was actually precise and accurate ongoing. And most importantly, even if it was working and you knew it was working, there was no business model to sustain that at scale, to ensure that impact was going to happen day after day at scale, to incentivize essentially these millers to do a very precise job correctly all the time. So these 3 big boxes were the reason why previous organizations always failed to develop out of a pilot stage. And ultimately, that was our challenge. If we could check these 3 boxes, we could reach literally hundreds of millions of people. And this is where we got to today, these 3 boxes. So I'll walk you through how we essentially checked these 3 big challenges and got to the point of today, reaching close to 2 million people. So first, we had to invent a technology, a machine, that could do that precise job. It was a machine that had to be light, it had to be a one-size-fits-all, it had to be completely automated and precise to add a concentrated form of key vitamins and nutrients to flour. And it had to remove all human error from the miller, meaning we could not rely on the miller to do a calibration or try to make an equation or a calculation of how many nutrients needed to be added to this flour. The machine had to be the brain, and it had to be automated. Just to walk you through exactly how the machine works, it's basically 2 compartments. It's an electronic machine. The first compartment is where the maize is added to. It's a weight scale, and it weighs that maize as it flows into the mill. And based on loss of technology, the front compartment, which is filled with these nutrients, doses a specific amount of nutrients based on that loss of weight. So we're always falling within that standard, the Tanzanian standard or the WHO standard, whichever premix nutrients we use, it's always going to be correctly mixed. Again, requiring no intervention from the actual miller and removing all human error. So it's very easy to install. It takes about 5 minutes out of the box to install. It's very easy to train because it's completely automated. Again, we don't have to spend weeks training a miller. Literally within minutes, they're up and running. So we work in Tanzania, a country the size of France. We have hundreds of small mills now with our machines spread throughout remote locations. A few years ago, our model was to drive around trying to sell them the nutrients, give them the machine. Every few weeks, we'd go to a mill and check if the machine was actually being used, needed maintenance, or if the miller needed some extra supplies. We were spending a lot of money on fuel, a lot of bandwidth, and money on our staff's time getting around. Often, we'd show up to a mill, and the machine might have been, our machine might have broke a few weeks ago, but the miller never told us. And meanwhile, he'd go for 2 or 3 weeks without fortifying their flour. At that point, we realized our method of monitoring was not scalable. So this is the second box. There was 3. This is the second box referring to the monitoring challenge that we had to check. So we had to reach out to a partner that could give us the ability to essentially remote monitor all of our mills spread out throughout East Africa. And so Vodafone gave us IoT, the Internet of Things. 2 or 3 years ago, this was a new fad. I wasn't so aware of it, but really it's revolutionized the way that we run our business and our ability to remote monitor. So essentially, they gave us a piece of hardware with a SIM card, a small, affordable piece of hardware that we attached to each one of our machines. And now in real time, the production data from each of these mills, over 200, the amount of flour they're producing, the premix and nutrients they're dispensing, any technical issues, if a load cell is broken, or even if the machine is overheating, All of that information is sent to my phone every 5 minutes. So right now, I can look at a phone in the corner near Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania and know every 5 minutes exactly how much nutrients they're putting in the flour. I can make a calculation based on daily consumption rates, and I know every 5 minutes how many people that machine is actually feeding. So we have an incredible monitoring tool to know when machines are working, how much they're working, how much they're producing, when they need fixed, and when the mill needs delivery of new nutrients, because we're the supply chain. So we can make a calculation based on how much they're producing, how much we delivered them 2 weeks ago, and we can be more cost effective and know exactly when we have to visit a mill. Now that saves us a lot of money. This is kind of a visual what it looks like as far as the monitoring tool. All our machines hooked up to our dashboards. We have a lot of analytics. I mentioned a few high-level things, but we have a lot of analytics to see how efficient a machine is, how efficient a mill is, and ultimately we want to build their businesses, so we have a lot of analytics on how they're running their business, seasonality throughout the year. The most important thing is to go back to the example how we were running a few years ago, wasting a lot of money with our staff, driving around essentially blind around a country the size of France. Now, one of our staff can monitor about 100 mills. Before it was maybe 20. So each one of our staff has a portfolio of 100 mills that he's responsible to visit, to maintain, to build their businesses, to supply these nutrients to. The most important thing, which is really impressive, that on average, as you recall, each one of these mills is producing and feeding every day enough flour to reach 5,000 people. So now, what that looks like is one staff, his salary, his phone, his fuel, his vehicle maintenance, all his costs are averaged across 500,000 people. And that's our goal, is to get our cost per person per year down to as close to zero as possible. And technology has allowed us to be extremely cost effective and have a really streamlined staffing model. So those were two first boxes. The technology, check. The monitoring tool, check. The third one is the sustainable business model. What's going to incentivize these millers to do a job? If it's going to cost them something, they're not going to want to do it. If it's going to make them their life difficult and slow their business, they're not going to want to do it. Now, to go back again, we made a lot of mistakes in the early stages, fail early, fail often type thing. And our original business model was to drive around, give the miller a machine to use, then try to sell him these nutrients, put a margin on the nutrients, and that would cover our costs. And we thought, that's great. Of course, it's a good thing. Everyone's altruistic. Of course, these millers want to help their community, so they'll pay more for these nutrients and charge a premium for their fortified flour. It failed. I would drive around to mills to collect money. They'd see me. They'd literally run out the back of the mill. So our relationship with them was not a positive relationship. We looked like a tax collector. And these are small businesses, and our job is not to put businesses out of business, but to build them up. So we had to be creative and realistic. This is Africa. It's very difficult to charge them something. They neither could absorb that cost as a production cost, nor could they pass that to the consumer and charge a premium. A mother will always choose a cheaper product because they look exactly the same. Flour is flour. It's very hard to sell the concept of fortification because the nutrients are invisible. And to tell a mother, don't worry, over a generation, your child will be a bit taller, it's a hard sell. So we had to be creative and think, business 101, you're not going to sell somebody something they don't see value in. It's going to be very difficult. So why don't we look at other inefficiencies within their business, things they're already purchasing, and see if we can reduce those costs and put that margin towards the additional cost of fortification. So we identified that every miller, before we showed up, every miller on average was spending about $4,000 a year on empty flour bags they used to pack their flour to sell to consumers. Then we would come along and say, great, we want to sell you nutrients enough for the entire year, cost you about $1,000. So essentially, we increased his cost by 25%. Again, he couldn't absorb that 25%. The market couldn't absorb it. It didn't work. So what we did is we grouped all our millers together, at that time about 100. Instead of the millers at that point were buying from middlemen, these flour bags, paying a premium because they're purchasing small amounts. We grouped 100 of our millers together. We went directly to the wholesaler flour bag big factory. And we were able to see some volume economics because we were bulk purchasing these bags and buying them for multiple months. We were able to achieve a 25% discount on the flour bags. Then we bundled in the nutrients as a package and sold it to them for $4,000. Obvious math. Now they're getting nutrients in flour bags for $4,000. Previously, they were just buying flour bags for $4,000. What this achieves is that he doesn't have to absorb an additional cost, yet he's still paying for the nutrients, so it's sustainable. Plus, in the market, a mother can now see a nice branded bag, because we brand them with the government seal. It's all certified and safe and clean. She sees a nice branded bag that says fortified, but really it speaks quality, and it's the same price as unfortified in an inferior bag. So we've changed behavior without changing economic behavior. We haven't put a burden on the consumer. That's when we really shot off as far as the onboarding of new millers, the reach of people that were actually eating this fortified flour. Our problem now is trying to keep up with demand of every day 5 to 10 millers wanting to join our program. Where a few years ago, we were begging millers to join our program. So this was a huge shift. And this was the third big box that we checked. And really, the success of our program is up to this business model that we've proven in Tanzania. So the success of our program can really be summed up in this one photo. 2 or 3 years ago, you would not have seen a small mill full of these pink flour bags. These are Sanku Project Healthy Children pink flour bags that we deliver to the mills. They purchase them, they pack flour, fortified flour. Everywhere we work now, it's saturated with pink. It's a great monitoring tool that I can literally drive through a village and not even get out of the car and point to a shop and say, fortified, fortified, fortified. The Food and Drug Agency of Tanzania can also say, this is trusted, it's fortified. So you wouldn't have seen that a few years ago. You wouldn't have seen trucks being filled with fortified flour, distributing not only throughout Tanzania, some going into Kenya, Congo, Rwanda, Malawi. All of East Africa is now getting fortified flour that they wouldn't have gotten before. Remember, large, centrally processed food doesn't reach the people who need it most. A few years ago, a miller would not be able to do the job of fortification because he couldn't afford it. And most importantly, a few years ago, a mother couldn't afford fortified flour, but now they can because the cost has been neutralized. So with this business model, over the next 6 years, if we have $20 million over 6 years, we'll reach 100 million people. If we have $20 million in philanthropy, at which point we are fully sustained and our growth is sustained, meaning we are free of philanthropy at that point through this business model. Even though we're a nonprofit, we have a revenue stream that we're able to reinvest into our organization, purchase more machines, hire more staff, vehicles, flour bag, nutrients, and we'll be fully sustained, free of philanthropy in the next 6 years if we are able to achieve $20 million in philanthropy funding. I'll end on this slide because it does take a village to help a village. We are here because of our research partners. We are here because of our implementation partners, our funders, and all our supporters have got us here through monetary support, through research support, academia, and just general partnerships on the ground. So we are a product of a lot of help. We have another 6 years that we need a lot of help, but at which point we'll be reaching a lot of people, 100 million people, and ending malnutrition. So on that note, I thank you very much.